You are listening to another No Fair Remembering Stuff, the Tuesday edition of the Professional Left Podcast, and available wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, proleftpod.com, where you can also contribute to this podcast. There is a Patreon button at our website, or you can mail us a letter and or contribution at the Professional Left Podcast, P.O. Box 9133, Springfield, Illinois, 62791. And if you hear some humming and buzzing in the background of this broadcast, it's because we are running the air conditioner today because there is a heat index 10 feet from where I'm sitting of 108 degrees with 1,000% humidity. So we're running the air. You usually don't. It makes a funny noise, but today, please bear with us because it's real hot here and it's going to be hot through Friday.
And this podcast is not safe for work.
Today, we're going to be exploring a tale as old as time. The authoritarian impulse to thwart democracy by any means necessary whenever the authoritarians don't get their way.
This is the totally true story of an election that turned into, quote, a street fight for the presidency of the United States, unquote. An election in which the difference between the sides came down to this, quote, Democrats wanted to do the right thing, and Republicans wanted to win, unquote.
Yeah, they did. This is an election that began with false claims of victory by the Republicans that led to a riot and 40 days of chaos, the likes of which the country had never seen before. Among the cast of main and peripheral characters of this event were Amy Coney Barrett, John Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh, Matt Schlapp, Matthew Dowd, Rudy Giuliani, Ted Cruz, Roger Stone, Benjamin Ginsburg, torture enthusiast and Emmanuel S. Heller Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, John Woo, and of course, Fox News and conservative talk radio. Now, to give you an issue of time, a measure of time, right now, our middle child and youngest child are both in college. We just returned middle child to college this weekend. And all of this happened before they were even born, back during what millions of wishful thinkers still think of as the good old days of American politics. And this event changed the country forever.
This is a 2018 Washington Post quote from Brad Blakeman, a George W. Bush campaign operative who proudly admitted to coordinating what he prefers to call the Brooks Brothers Rebellion, and denies that things got violent. Quote, it had to be a three-legged stool. We had to fight in the courts, in the recount centers, and in the streets, in public opinion, Blakeman said. He dressed up two staffers as a turkey and a pilgrim, with a sign that said, stuff the turkey, not the ballot box. He put another in a Grinch outfit, calling him the Gore-inch instead of stealing Christmas stole the election. Who, instead of stealing Christmas, stole the election. He flew an anti-Gore banner over the city from an airplane, handed out free Don't Be Had by a Chad t-shirts, and gave away sore loserman, instead of Gore Lieberman, crying towels, unquote. From the same article, quote, in contrast, the Gore campaign didn't seem concerned about the optics on the ground, just the situation in the courts, Blakeman said. Gore left a leg off the stool, and that's why the stool fell, he said, unquote.
And if you haven't guessed by now, yes, we're talking about the November 22nd, 2000 Brooks Brothers riot, a loud, aggressive demonstration led by Republican staffers at a meeting of election canvassers in Miami-Dade County, Florida, during a recount of votes made during the 2000 United States presidential election that was organized and executed for the express purpose of shutting down the recount. And you know what? We're not the only people to notice the really eerie similarities between the Republican Brooks Brothers riot of 2000 and the Republican insurrection of 2021. This is from the Nation magazine of August of 2022. Quote, in the wake of a bitterly disputed presidential election, a central hub of government operations was suddenly under siege. A group of aggrieved right-wing protesters defied security and flooded into the now chaotic center of activity. Government officials were harassed and feared for their safety as charges of fraud and betrayal of the people's will rose up from the angry mob. No, this wasn't January 6, 2021. It was 2 decades earlier, on the day before Thanksgiving in the year 2000. The target wasn't the U.S. Capitol, but instead the nondescript Stephen B. Clark Government Center in downtown Miami. Election officials had congregated there to review disputed ballots marred by ambiguous or otherwise imperfect impressions of electoral intent on the part of voters in the deadlocked 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. They were met by a throng of Republicans clad in polo shirts chanting, "Sing it with me now, shut it down. Shut it down."
But, like the January 6th Republican insurrection, the Republican effort to disrupt a free and fair election by rioting a quarter of a century ago wasn't their only strategy. Instead, it was part of a much bigger scheme, which attacked the election on many fronts in the hopes that they could introduce so much chaos and uncertainty into the process that the whole thing would end up being decided by a Supreme Court dominated by conservative judges appointed by George W. Bush's daddy and George Bush's daddy's boss, Ronald Reagan. And you know what? It worked.
You mean try to force an election to be decided by a Supreme Court made up of judges appointed by Republicans?
Yep.
That's crazy, Blue Gal. And do you remember what that decision, the appended end of that decision was?
Yeah. You can never use this decision again.
Right. And by the way, this isn't a precedent. Just ignore this ever happened. Or, in other words, don't remember this. No fair remembering
this. Right. Yeah. Right.
And that playbook of flooding the media with bullshit, corporate-sponsored mobs and physical intimidation and endless court challenges has been handed down to today's Republicans like the family Bible. Which leaves us with this big question. Where did all that berserk, shut it down energy disappear to between November of 2000 and January of 2020? Well, it turns out it was there all the time. But by 2009, it had changed its name to the Tea Party.
Many of the Brooks Brothers rioters went on to pretty good jobs in the Bush-Cheney administration. That mob scene they participated in became something that Republicans put on their resumes when applying for the right kind of Republican Party job or the right kind of conservative movement job. Well, now, the teabag healthcare riots that we're seeing, the shout 'em down, shut 'em down thuggery being staged right now at town hall meetings about healthcare, is again a source of conservative pride as corporate lobbying groups brag about their ability to turn out the mobs, to shut down the democratic process. Because, of course, the single most important piece of the history of the Brooks Brothers riot is that it worked.
Remember all those right-wing clowns who flooded town council meetings and PTA meetings to intimidate and outshout everyone else over immigration and critical race theory? And all those armed thugs who seized state houses during the pandemic because wearing a mask to protect your neighbor from the plague was worse than slavery? And the anti-choice fanatics who kept using intimidation, bombings, murder, lies, conservative media, and conservative fanatics on state courts to roll back women's basic civil rights until they got a Supreme Court who would make it all legal. And even today, after the 2021 insurrection, we have banning books in libraries. Bomb threats against libraries now.
Mm-hmm.
All of this flows from that Republican Brooks Brothers riot ethos that says when things don't go your way, if you throw a loud enough tantrum and intimidate the right people, you can get what you want. You might even be famous for 5 minutes on Fox News. And I've always said that that's the reward structure for the boots on the ground.
Yeah, that's right.
To behave badly in public settings gets you famous. It's a lottery. You might win an interview with Hannity or Tucker or whoever it is.
Mm-hmm.
This is from ProPublica from June 16th, 2022. It's an important article that really gives the game away. The headline is, white parents rallied to chase a black educator out of town. Then they followed her to the next one. Quote, inside a gabled white clubhouse overlooking the hills of a Cherokee County golf course, dozens of parents from across the county had assembled on a Sunday afternoon for a lesson in an emerging form of warfare. School board meetings would be their battlefield. Their enemy was critical race theory. One of several presenters at the meeting was Rhonda Thomas, a frequent guest on conservative podcasts and the founder of the Atlanta-based Truth in Education, a national nonprofit that aims to educate parents and teachers about radical ideologies being taught in schools. So what is critical race theory? Thomas asked the crowd. It teaches kids that whites are inherently racist and oppressive, perhaps unconsciously, and that all whites are responsible for all historical actions and should feel guilty. Guess what? That's not what critical race theory is, but nobody cares.
And guess what? It's not taught in any form in any elementary or high school
Ever.
Anywhere.
Another presenter, a local paralegal named Noel Cahan, leads the nonprofit Protect Student Health Georgia, which aims to educate on harmful indoctrination, including comprehensive sexuality education and gender ideology. Cahan emphasized how to grab attention during upcoming school board meetings. Identify the best speakers in the group, she told them, adding, it's okay to be emotional. Be sure to capture video of them addressing the board, or even consider hiring a professional videographer. It's good in case Chucker Carlson wants to put you on air, Cahan said. It really helps.
It really does. And
unquote.
Let's all remember that the Tea Party town hall meetings were one extended, hysterical, racist, primal scream by the same Republicans who were cool with George Bush stealing the election and who were flocked to the polls to elect Donald Trump. There's no break in continuity among these people.
And don't pretend that MAGA is some sort of isolated movement.
No, at all. Because
they're Republicans.
In the most infamous photo from the Brooks Brothers riot, there's not a single person there from Miami, despite the fact Republicans kept insisting that it was all spontaneous uprising of outraged ordinary citizens such as yourself, like the Tea Party. We're independents. We're not Republicans. Why do you keep calling us Republicans? We're wearing these funny hats. I don't even know George Bush. Never heard of the man. Instead, in this picture, you can spot at least 10 Republican aides and operatives, a number of whom were being paid for their participation by the Bush-Cheney Recount Committee. There was Tom Pyle, who was an aide to despicable Republican Congressman Tom DeLay. There was Gary Melfreus, the former staff director of the House Judiciary Committee on Criminal Justice. There's Rory Cooper, staff member with the National Republican Congressional Committee. Kevin Smith, not the director of Chasing Amy and the Clerk's Extended Universe. This Kevin Smith was a former House Republican conference analyst. Then there was Stephen Brophy, former aide to Senator Sleepy Fred Thompson. Remember Fred Mentum, honey?
No, I do. Fred Mentum.
He was going to be president. There was Matt Crotch Grabber Schlapp, who at the time was a Bush campaign staffer. Roger Moore, but not the cool Roger Moore. This Roger Moore was aide to Republican Congressman William Vanderpool Van Hillary, however you pronounce that last name. There was Dwayne Gibson, aide to Republican Congressman Don Young. Chuck Royal, aide to then Republican Congressman Jim DeMint. And Lena McConkey, former assistant to Republican Jim Ross Lightfoot.
This is Joe Geller's firsthand account of the riot as reported in the Washington Post. Quote, Joe Geller was deep in the trenches. The county's Democratic Party chairman was worried that thousands of Miami-Dade ballots might have been affected by a voting machine glitch, potentially costing Gore the election. So on November 22nd, he headed to the drab government high-rise in downtown Miami, where a manual recount was underway. But when he arrived, he found the lobby and elections office filled with several dozen protesters, many of them in suit jackets and button-down shirts. Geller had walked into the Brooks Brothers riot, a protest organized by Republican campaign operatives congressional staffers, and lawyers. When Geller asked election officials for a sample ballot to test his voting machine theory, the GOP operatives suddenly surrounded him, accusing him of stealing ballots to try to influence the election, he told the Washington Post in a telephone interview. This one guy was tripping me and pushing me and kicking me, recalled Geller, who is now a state legislator. At one point, I thought if they knocked me over, I could have literally got stomped to death. Brad Blakeman, a Bush campaign operative who proudly admits to coordinating what he prefers to call the Brooks Brothers Rebellion, denies that things got violent, unquote. But then, don't they always?
Sure.
I think it was Antifa Driftglass.
I was going to say it's Antifa, it's Black Lives Matter, and the FBI who really staged the January 6th.
Infiltrated, right.
Infiltrated the stage and triggered. All those people were there peaceful. It was just a tourist visit to the Capitol. Meanwhile, back at the Washington Post, quote, perhaps the most famous operative on the scene was Nixon's very own dirty trickster himself, Roger Stone, because Roger Stone is everywhere. In a 2008 New Yorker profile, Stone claimed he had been recruited by none other than James Baker III, the former Secretary of State leading the Bush recount team, and that it was Stone's idea to court protesters via Cuban radio. The idea we were putting out there was that this was a left-wing power grab by Gore, the same way Fidel Castro did it in Cuba, he told Jeffrey Toobin. We were very explicit drawing that analogy. Stone claimed he ran the Brooks Brothers riot from a Winnebago parked near the election office. He said, I set up my command center there, he told Toobin. I had walkie-talkies and cell phones, and I was in touch with our people in the building. Our whole idea was to shut the recount down. That was why we were there. We had the frequency to the Democrats' walkie-talkies and were listening to their communications, but they were so disorganized that we didn't learn much that was useful, unquote. Now, of course, it is possible Roger Stone is lying because Roger Stone lies all the time. Meanwhile, as the deadline approached, the recount team abandoned the impossible job of manually recounting more than 650,000 ballots and instead decided to focus only on a much more reasonable alternative, the 10,750 ballots that had been rejected by the counting machines. Predictably, Republicans freaked out completely because freaking out over everything was the strategy. And they also reacted very quickly.
Once again, we turn to Joe Geller's eyewitness account in the Washington Post. Quote, by the time Geller stepped off the elevator and into the elections office to grab a sample ballot, the Brooks Brothers riot was well underway, with protesters shouting, voter fraud and let us in, according to the New York Times. They were banging on windows, he said. People in the office were scared. As an elections officer handed him the sample ballot, clearly labeled as such, he said a GOP organizer with a clipboard started shouting, he stole a ballot! Geller quickly got back in the elevator. A group of protesters followed him. These people who had been kicking me were suddenly very quiet, he said of the elevator ride. When we got to the bottom, it started back up again. They were chasing me, and I was just trying to get to the exit. One man in particular seemed to be setting a pick on Geller, he recalled. He would jump in front of me and stop, so I'd run into him, he said. At one point, the man threw himself into Geller before delivering a warning. If you do that again, I'll be forced to defend myself, Geller recalled the man saying. The scene was captured in the Times and Tapper's book. The crowd is pulling at the cops, pulling at Geller, Tapper wrote. It's insanity. Several angry Republicans, many of whom had acted as observers during the recount, surrounded Geller in the lobby of the building and accused him of slipping a ballot in his back pocket in the tabulation room, wrote Dana Kennedy and Dexter Filkins for the Times, unquote.
Now, does this remind anyone of Rudy Giuliani accusing Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss of passing a USB drive back and forth as if it were cocaine during the ballot count in Georgia, proving that they were interfering and falsifying votes, because it damn well should, because it's exactly the same fucking strategy. The Washington Post continues, quote, soon about a dozen sheriff's deputies surrounded Mr. Geller as the crowd, which had grown quickly to more than 100 people, yelled cuff him and busted. Another Democratic official told reporters he was punched and kicked as well. When Geller told authorities what was going on, however, the deputies escorted him back upstairs to see the election officials who confirmed his account and then to his car. He got home just in time to switch on the television and see the Miami-Dade canvassing board pull an extraordinary about-face, voting to abandon the manual recount altogether and potentially depriving the Gore campaign of hundreds, if not thousands of votes they had hoped to pick up in the county. All sides admitted the Brooks Brothers riot played a decisive role, unquote.
The lesson Republicans drew from that riot and the events that followed was simple. If things don't go your way, show up with a mob and create chaos. Drown out opposing voices, just as they did in the Tea Party town hall meetings. Stage huge rallies accusing Democrats of every crime imaginable. Get enough of their craziest people elected to office to throw sand in the gears and intimidate other elected officials. Stage armed takeovers of state capitals during a pandemic. Block traffic with rolling roadblocks. Crash the system. Create a violent mob veto over all government action. Shut everything down.
Because in Florida, Republicans learned the most valuable lesson of all, that this actually works, that fascist tactics often really do work, and that the established media and political institutions have no freaking idea how to cope with the threat of homegrown brown shirts who are trying to burn our democracy down.
I want to talk for a minute about, you have at the beginning of the show that Amy Coney Barrett and also Brett Kavanaugh were a part of this whole process.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
They were Republican operatives as well.
Yes, they were. Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, Kenneth Chesebro, who is now an indicted co-conspirator in the Georgia case, was on Team Gore at this time. And apparently he was a registered Democrat until 2016. So he was definitely a close observer of the Gore defeat and the tactics used to do it. Now, you wanted to talk about Ben Ginsburg.
Yeah, I think it might have been Charlie Pierce who called America's attention to the fact that Ben Ginsburg, who was played in this wonderful movie called Recount by Bob Balaban.
Oh, yeah.
Who every time the Gore campaign filed a motion or suggested anything would just rise up in tiny man righteous indignation and talk about the sort of unprecedented depravity of the Democrats and how dare they do these horrible things and what monsters they are. And there's this scene where he asks James Baker about, I heard you were once a Democrat, as if I heard you were once a child molester. And it didn't occur to him that Democrats, especially Bill Clinton and Al Gore, were anything less than the devil. And this is the same Ben Ginsburg that MSNBC has rehabilitated and brought back on the air during the 2016 election and afterwards to talk about the depravity of the Trump campaign and how unprecedented the Trump campaign is. And oh my goodness, isn't that a terrible, terrible thing? Without mentioning his official status with the Bush 2000 and 2004 campaigns, because remembering that stuff is incredibly inconvenient to the people who would remember the whole thing, the whole story. And, you know, the Florida recount ended up in the courts, and the Trump recount ended up in 60 courts. It was thrown out in every court, 61, and thrown out in 60. And it will land in more courts, and it will probably end up in the Supreme Court. At least 2 of these indictments may end up there. The reason we don't remember the Tea Party racist freakout during the Obama administration is because it didn't work. But it did work. Because
it absolutely did work, yeah.
They were absolutely able to shut down and intimidate and convince scumbags like Mitch McConnell and advisors like Newt Gingrich to just block everything Obama tried to do. Every time Barack Obama tried to do anything, it was slavery in the end of the world. It was
and it flipped a lot of seats in 2010 as well.
It did. And the Freedom Caucus got in there. Yeah. And those people are now the calm centrist ones that we should all look back
they
on.
They want to shut down the government if they don't stop prosecuting Trump.
Right. Paul Ryan is now a reasonable centrist. You know?
Yeah, he is. Absolutely.
But that's how far the Overton window has slammed into the right, thousands of miles to the right. And only if you bother to remember how this all got started and when this got started and how often they use this tactic at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level, all the time. And how it's all very well thought out. All the nonprofits that these assholes form to fund their attacks on school boards and their attacks on libraries and their attacks on trans kids are all part of the same playbook. And
Right.
it's a fascist playbook. It is go after them in the courts, tie them up in courts because they always have an infinite amount of money for trial, just to throw a bunch of lawsuits into court, get as many crackpot judges on the bench as you can. And hey, Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court now, Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court now, John Roberts, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court now. So it worked. And we're going to be stuck with these people for at least a generation.
And this is also creating moral panic among white women.
Yeah, it is.
Now, that's not so much with the Brooks Brothers riot, but with all this CRT stuff and healthcare and just creating an emotional gut reaction and then rewarding those folks with fame and attention and community. And it works.
It does.
All of a sudden, you're youth for Hitler or ladies for Hitler. And it's white women with time on their hands to do actual fascist organizing for the Republican Party.
Yeah, we did a show, I believe, late last year on Katie Abrams. Remember Katie Abrams? Katie Abrams was like a weather girl and had some media experience, some marketing experience. And she was one of the people that got up and was very TV friendly and was screaming at a town hall meeting about she doesn't want this country to turn into Soviet Russia because Barack Obama was a filthy communist and Obamacare was going to turn this country into Soviet Russia. And I don't want my country to turn into Soviet Russia. And she found suddenly a whole career open to her.
Yeah.
On the right.
She still has a job with the Koch brothers.
Yeah.
To this day.
She did fine. She's got some other thing now that she does, sending text messages to phones for political purposes.
Right.
But there really is a tangible financial and status reward structure on the right for being the biggest asshole in the room. Because that's then, and the GOP scouts are out. They're looking for these people. They're looking to elevate them, and they're looking for the next enemy. So in 2000, the enemy was Al Gore, and then it was the Kenyan usurper. And between the two of those, there was the America-hating, terrorist-loving liberals who hated George Bush and wanted us to lose in Iraq. And then there was the crazy liberal lefty commies who elected Barack Obama. And then there was the death panels. And then there was CRT. And then it was trans kids. There will always
now
find...
it's the Biden crime family.
The Biden crime family. And Hillary's emails. They will always find a new enemy. And trending on Twitter like today was, and I don't like to look for Twitter for anything except a sewer full of turds, which is what it is. But trending today was like hashtag Biden worst presidents in history or something like that.
Yeah.
Because they always need a new, bigger, terrifying enemy to justify the fact that they're fascists. They're open, proud, loud, racist assholes. And rather than accept the consequences of being that, they want to believe they're in the majority. They want to believe they're right with God. And therefore, they want to believe that we're all devils. And therefore, any tactic is acceptable. Whether it's storming an election recount center in Florida or storming the state capitol a quarter century later, and everything in between is all legit with God and with St. Ronald Reagan because they're right and we're all wrong.
If you have enjoyed this show, we would like you to consider becoming a $5 or $10 Patreon. We really need more Patreons to make this podcast fly. So if you can afford to support us in that way, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/proleftpod. And thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
See you next time.
See you next time.
The Professional Left podcast No Fair Remembering Stuff Tuesday edition is produced under a Creative Commons license. Copyright 2022-23, DGBG Productions.